Welcome to Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. On today's podcast is my brother, Dave Ostler. Dave and his dear wife, Rachelle, are active members of the church living in Virginia. Dave is calling in for today's podcast. Dave has served as a mission president in Sierra Leone and as a stake president and service missionary on the East Coast. As part of their callings, they have reached out to members who no longer attend to better understand the why behind why they left. Dave recently released a website called stakeandwardresources.com, designed to help local leaders better minister to members who have stepped away or members working on their faith. Dave's contact info is on that website. Welcome, Dave.
Well, it's good to be on your podcast, Richard.
Thanks. We're glad to have you here. Dave is phoning in. I'm in Salt Lake for our listeners, and Dave is phoning in from his home in Virginia. It's springtime in both parts of the country, so it's a great time of year. Let's start with this talk that you gave. I think as I read your talk that you gave recently, it's a great way to frame up what you're trying to help our members understand. So do you want to give us any background on this talk before we just kind of start going through it?
Yeah. Over the last couple of years, I've been interested in understanding why people no longer attend church and why their beliefs have changed. And recently, I've been working in our stake as a church service missionary with my wife, and one of our tasks and responsibilities has been to reach out to people who don't attend and to be able to invite them back. And as we've done that, we've wanted to know why they don't attend. Why did they once attend, have belief, go on missions, whatever their level of activity is or was, and why did it change? And that's kind of led to a year's worth of work, both in context of our calling, but also in context of just us wanting to understand that better. And as we've done that, we've talked with leaders, and we had an opportunity to speak in a sacrament meeting. I had an opportunity to speak in a sacrament meeting outside of our ward about what we had learned and how leaders and members can think differently about people who no longer participate and don't have belief.
That's very helpful background just as we get into your actual talk that you gave. So thank you, Dave. Go ahead and just kind of start with your talk.
Well, I briefly introduce the journey that I've been on, understanding, talking with people. We did some surveys of people both inside our stake and outside of our stake. We wanted to kind of understand empirically why people stopped attending, what the implications of that were. We read and listened to just about everything we could find, both by general authorities, researchers, opinion leaders, and I've become an active participant in the Bloggernacle and on social media.
And as you talk about that, knowing you as my brother, and just for our listeners, my brother Dave is very analytically driven. His career has been fact-based information to help make thoughtful decisions. So when you talk about what you did, Dave, it makes sense with your life expertise and experience to sort of see a question, why do people step away, and sort of be willing to, from an analytical and an empirical and a qualitative standpoint, say, hey, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to pull back the onion and peel back the layers and try to understand what's going on here. So that's why me personally have been very excited about your research and your willingness to better understand and help all of us.
Yeah, I think it's easy to come into a situation with preconceived notions. And in the case of people no longer attending church, we have notions and belief about that. We've heard that people can be offended, or some people just don't want to keep the commandments. And as we have approached both calling and as I have tried to understand, we realize that it's better to step back and go to people and ask them, go to researchers who've really studied this and see what the data says. And in the remarks I gave in that sacrament meeting, I said that really each person is unique and they have their own stories. We as people have an eternal history. We've been born in unique circumstances and culture, and we really have a distinctive genetic set of predispositions. We come in different shapes and sizes. We're men and women. We're millennials. I'm a boomer. Some of us live in Virginia. Some of us were born in foreign countries. Our minds work differently. There's skeptical scientists. There's creative writers. Because of that, we perceive the world differently. And, you know, the differences are wonderful. The world's a better place because of the differences. It's more interesting. And just like we're different, each person's faith is unique. And as we've learned, there's no real single reason why someone has doubts and someone leaves the church. But the reasons do fit into general categories, which if we understand can help us develop a stronger faith ourselves. But it also allows us to better minister to those people around us that have developed doubts and for those that have left the church.
That's very interesting to me, the reasons. Talk to us more about the reasons, Dave.
Well, I mentioned in this talk that there's three issues that I think are kind of the general reasons, and you can't ever generalize without oversimplification. But I discussed them and then suggested ways that parents, friends, leaders can respond. The first is that as the church became a worldwide church, it simplified its message and story, partly so that missionaries could explain the history of the church and create a uniform message. I served as mission president in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Very poor place. It's wonderful that the members there are taught the same lesson from the same manual on the same Sunday in the Kontolo branch in Sierra Leone as it would in my home ward. But some of the members in my home ward have graduate degrees in science and humanities, and they understand that history is really just stories about events that we link together through interpretation. Literacy is a luxury good in Kontolo. Most members are really just worried about their next meal. The church materials have to work in both places, and that creates a challenge. And the church recognizes that, and they're working on ways to kind of respond to that. President Ballard, 2 years ago, to seminary and institute teachers said, it was only a generation ago that our young people's access to information about our history, doctrine, practices was basically limited to materials printed by the church. Few state students came in contact with alternative interpretations. Mostly our young people lived in a sheltered life. Our curriculum at that time, though well-meaning, didn't prepare students for today, a day when students have instant access to virtually everything about the church from every possible point of view. And I think it's only natural that the church focused on the wonderful stories. Sugar-coated, overly simplistic account of events of Joseph's day may be sufficient in one part of the world, but in others it becomes a stumbling block. And particularly in a day with Google, it just doesn't hold up. When some members learn the more complex reality, particularly from people outside of the church or our families, they may feel their faith challenged and may lose trust in the church as an institution.
That certainly resonates with me, Dave, just from my experience as serving in a YSA assignment. From that perspective, the youth, as you're well communicating here, they just, when they have a question, they just go to Google and they find out the information they're looking for, and that can be very consistent with what the church teaches and part of our narrative, or it can be much more complex, and sometimes that is accurate with the facts of the day. So I think you're doing a good job of illustrating the difference, not only between some areas of the world, but between age groups and how younger people are learning about history and information.
Well, I think the church is somewhere in the middle of a transition between the simplistic narratives and a more durable framework for teaching church history. The curriculums are evolving. The youth curriculum is different now. It's starting to represent history in a more balanced and accurate way. Primary, the stories will always be simple. But even in primary, we can talk about seer stones. We can refer to heavenly parents. And as our youth grow, we need to be more familiar with and teach the more complex history. We need to acknowledge our limitations and mistakes. The church has really given us some new tools, including the gospel topic essays and the Joseph Smith papers. And church really has an interest in creating a new era in historical transparency as a way of responding. And as teachers and parents, we need to be more comfortable with our history and to be able to teach beyond the sugarcoating. That means we need to learn it too. Elder Ballard charged leaders and teachers, he said, to understand the doctrinal and historic context and context of the scriptures in our history, we need to study from the best books as the Lord directed. The best books include the scriptures, the teachings upon our prophets and apostles, and the best LDS scholarship available. And if necessary, we should ask those with appropriate training, experience, and expertise for help. This is exactly what I do. I think his words are great. Marlon Jensen was our church historian and a member of the Quorum of the 70, and he said, I believe the best antidote we have for anyone's faith crisis is to tell the whole story and lay it out the way it happened or the way we think it happened to the best of our knowledge.
I love your quote of Elder Ballard and Marlon Jensen. Those are wonderful, and it sets up the framework of where the church is moving to in a very faithful and thoughtful way. So where should the church go from here, Dave? What are your thoughts on that?
Whether you are a teacher or a student, an adult or a youth, I think we use our teaching and learning experiences, opportunities to go beyond the overly simplistic. The church curriculum is being updated, and for some lessons, particularly regarding church history, there are extended materials that can help teachers and students. You can also find other best book materials to include in the class addressing the problems of the day. A resource I found, and there's many resources like this, but one that I'd like to highlight is the Sunday School supplements from the Mormon Women's Project, which highlights women's voices and experiences, which are so often, rarely, if ever, heard. Parents can become familiar with the gospel topic essays and decide how they'll teach their children. And in our classes, we probably shouldn't focus on problems, but we do need to be willing to discuss them. If you're a member of a class, don't be inclined to shut down someone on a discussion of a historical challenge. It diminishes our ability to be able to be intellectually honest and to engage people. And when we talk about those issues, our lessons will be intellectually richer and provide new insights into our faith. When hard questions come up, teachers can say, I don't know, but I'll research it and we can discuss next week.
I like that. I'll be honest, I haven't ever studied the Mormon's Women's Project. I love your point there that resource exists, and I love that it highlights women's voices and experience. And I think it's helpful for all of us to become more familiar with content like that so we can better represent and be women's voices as part of the overall curriculum. I love some of your thoughts here about the classroom situation. I know as a teacher, I didn't receive much training on how to handle when questions came up that were kind of difficult. And I love your thoughts here of being and validating those questions, and the idea that if we don't know, we should acknowledge that and say, we'll discuss that. David, let's go on to your second reason.
With a more mature analysis of history, we become aware that as a church we've made mistakes. Elder Uchtdorf said, "We openly acknowledge that in nearly 200 years of church history, along with an uninterrupted line of inspired, honorable, and divine events, there have been some things said and done that could cause people to question. And to be perfectly frank, there have been times when members or leaders in the church have simply made mistakes. There may have been things said or done that were not in harmony with our values, principles, or doctrine." I'm grateful for his acknowledgement of that. I think that's an important step for the church to highlight that we do make mistakes, and we can sustain our prophets, seers, and revelators, retaining a belief in their unique call, but also in their humanness. We can recognize Joseph and other prophets made mistakes. President Ballard said, "Too many people think church leaders and members should be perfect or nearly perfect. They forget that the Lord's grace is sufficient to accomplish his work through mortals. Our leaders have the best intentions, but sometimes we make mistakes." Elder Holland said, "Be kind regarding human frailty, your own as well as those who serve you in a church led by volunteer mortal men and women. Except in the case of his only begotten Son, imperfect people are all God has ever had to work with. That must be terribly frustrating to him, but he deals with it. So should we. And when you see imperfection, remember that the limitation is not in the divinity of the Word." We know our local leaders are just like us. We've been local leaders, and we know we've made mistakes. We're also aware that mistakes can shake faith. We should never be in a position where we minimize the pain that people can feel because of those mistakes. It would be wrong to minimize the pain of the woman who can't go to the temple because of the color of her skin, or the pain of an abused wife when a leader protects the abuser because of the promising potential of his career. The path of healing for those hurt by the mistakes of leaders is individual. We should never try and talk them out of their feelings, but we can listen to them, love them, and accept that their pain is real. We can be a friend by putting our arms around them and trying to understand. I personally have a hope in a Savior that knows us completely and offers us healing.
On a personal note, that's just so deeply tender for me, the way you're framing that up. I would guess there's many listeners perhaps that are feeling some feelings of emotion in the spirit as you validate people's pain and acknowledge that. I think that is so helpful, and the words that you said, potentially so healing. Where does that leave us, Dave?
We can balance the respect we have for leaders and their callings with an understanding that they're human. It's not disrespectful to acknowledge leader limitations, and we should resist equating position with righteousness. And as leaders, we do need to be more humble. I am grateful for our prophetic leadership, and I respect them and their calling. These are sincere men who serve with energy and passion. They seek the Lord in all they do. I'm excited about the leadership of President Nelson and sustain him and those called to service.
I'm deeply touched with the balance you're finding there of sustaining and supporting our leaders, including President Nelson, that I likewise support, and recognizing, as you point out, and Elder Ballard and Elder Uchtdorf have taught, that we are not perfect leaders. And I think that framework is a more healthy framework for our members that are struggling, most of which that I work with are working and want to find a way to stay in. And that framing can be helpful for them when you're acknowledging perhaps limitations and mistakes within their prophetic calling. Let's go to the third reason, Dave.
Before we do that, I do have to reflect upon my own experience as a leader. And
thank you. Please share some of that.
I've made mistakes. And, in reality, I've done things that were the best intended kind of things, but because of inexperience or culture or fatigue or whatever the reason is, I made mistakes and I caused pain. And some of these can't be fixed. Some of them have cost, I'm sure, people's trust in the gospel principles that the church represents. And so I am tender about the words of these leaders about being kind to leaders who make mistakes, because I think we who have served in leadership are certainly aware of the mistakes we've made.
That's a really thoughtful addition. Thank you, David.
You know, the third area that's worth talking about, and sometimes it can be related to these other two issues, is that some non-attenders just don't feel like they belong within our faith community. For whatever reason, they've attended and they felt like outsiders. Maybe they were new in the ward or single or childless. In their words, we gathered their words. We both listened to them and had them complete surveys. And some of them told us why they stopped attending. One said, "I'm liberal and I don't feel like I fit in." Another, "Single and out of place in a family ward." Another, "I'm gay and I don't feel emotionally safe at church." Another, "I'm young and older people dismiss my opinion." You know, other people are foreign born and they're trying to interface with a largely white upper middle class culture in the church and the English language, at least in the U.S. There are lots of reasons why people can't feel like they fit in. External researchers have shown that for some, and in particular women, our church culture can feel very judgmental. In fact, it's listed by 40% of younger women as one of the top reasons why they no longer attend. One non-attender told us, "I don't believe in so much of the cultural judgment and policies used towards members who struggle with doctrine and personal challenges." Others who struggle with doubt, including history or trust in leaders, feel our culture excludes them. A non-attender told us, "If the culture made it acceptable to attend while questioning, more people would stay. Right now, dissent is silence."
Wow.
You know, when Alma baptized his followers at the Waters of Mormon, the people made a covenant to create a unified community. They agreed to come into the fold of God and be willing to bear one another's burdens so they may be light, and be willing to mourn with those that mourn and comfort those that stand in need of comfort. We all need that. We all promise that. When we don't feel that because of mental health or marriage status or because we doubt, we withdraw, and we lose the fellowship of the community, and we often lose our belief in Christ. One of the great authors on this subject is a man named Patrick Mason. He wrote the book Planted, and he said in it, "Perhaps the most important thing we can do in the face of our current challenges is to make the church a more welcoming place for those who struggle, creating the conditions in which people feel comfortable while they work through questions and doubts in the midst of the body of Christ, rather than feeling excluded from it. More embracing Mormonism may thus be the most important factor in helping people more fully embrace Mormonism."
Dave, how can a ward respond?
You know, the ward has so many tools. I think of how a discussion could occur in a ward council meeting where you have a diverse group of leaders, each with different organizational responsibilities, that could just take that Patrick Mason quote and just kind of talk about it. We've got third-hour meetings, and on the first Sunday in those third-hour meetings, there's a council where everyone can participate. Wouldn't it be kind of marvelous to have a council discussion about how could we as the Relief Society or the Elders Quorum create a more welcoming culture? But we can also do it in our families and in our presidencies. And as we do that, I think the Lord will help us understand how individuals can feel excluded and can give us insights into how to help them. As we started this project and as we've talked with people, I have learned to see settings where I previously would have said something unknowing that would have been felt very judgmental, very painful, very excluding. And now with the awareness, and I'm sure it's only half complete, I can see those and I can avoid them. Adam Miller wrote a book called Letters to a Young Mormon, and he's one of these great thinkers on this subject. And he said to help them, meaning people who feel excluded, I don't need to show up their door to tell them what ought to keep them up at night. I need instead to listen. I need to let them tell me what keeps them from sleeping. I need to let them tell me what worries and frightens them. And in response, even if I don't share that worry, I need to be ready and willing to mourn with them as they mourn.
I know. I love the quote from Adam Miller and the way you frame this up. One of the concerns when I served in my YSA assignment, Dave, is a feeling that I could potentially drive the wedge further between them and Mormonism if I sort of validate, acknowledge, or even talk about their doubts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they have them, so you can ignore them, or you can acknowledge that that's the way they feel. And I think sometimes church leaders are kind of afraid that by discussing issues of church history or leader mistakes or inclusion or difference, that it actually creates doubt. But I think the reverse is the truth. Assuming that all will be well because we pretend certainty will only create a narrower and narrower community because people will leave. And we will lack influence and credibility to help people come unto Christ. I suspect that there are many listeners or friends of ours who've had a child, a friend, or a family member that no longer believes. I have endowed adult children who no longer believe. And I'm hopeful that by discussing these issues frankly and honestly, it might provide insight, hope, and compassion for us, regardless of their belief, their life experience, and their level of orthodoxy. I know that there often can be people that struggle. They can even be in congregations that struggle silently, and perhaps no one knows of their struggles. Maybe even their spouse or their teacher, their counselor doesn't know their struggles. And I think we have to accept that their journey is hard and lonely, and that sometimes they probably feel abandoned and angry. I know sometimes I feel like that, and I accept their pain. My journey is different, but sometimes I have had some of those feelings. And when I've had those moments, I try and draw close to the foundation of my belief, which is the Savior. I remember the words of Rosemary Wixom. She was a past general primary president, and she said that she had a friend with doubt. And in her words, she said, my friend thought that if Mother Teresa, and remember, Mother Teresa lived her whole life kind of unsure about even the existence of God. But this friend said that if Mother Teresa could live her religion without all the answers and without a feeling of clarity in all things, maybe she could too. She could take one simple step forward, another. She could focus on the truth she did believe and let those truths fill her heart and mind. And as she reflected back, she said to Sister Wixom, my testimony had become like a pile of ashes. It had all burned down. All that remained was Jesus Christ. And I think that's a great foundation, that Jesus Christ is that foundation. Marlon Jensen, I've referred to him in the past as our church historian and a past member of the 70s. He said, ultimately, it all centers on Christ. What we sincerely in our hearts think about him, believe about him, hope about him, is going to determine the kind of person that we'll be and what our actions are going to be. So when I look at this world and I ask the questions, where is Christ? Who has him? Who is living like him? Who is being taught his teachings? Where is it facilitated to do what he did? I'm led to our church. And Elder Holland, he gave that wonderful talk about songs that I cannot sing. That wasn't quite the title, but something to that effect. And he said, surely it follows that in singing the anthems of eternity, we should stand as close as possible to the Savior and Redeemer of the world, who has absolutely perfect pitch. We then take courage from his ability to hear our silence and take hope that his melodious messianic intercessions in our behalf Truly it is when the Lord is near that the dove of peace sings in my heart and the flowers of grace appear. That's when I feel peace, is when I'm close to my Savior.
Tell us more about your belief, David.
I see all of these issues. And I understand them, at least to some dimension. I'm not a professional historian, and I haven't heard everyone's experience. But I have found a way to retain belief that Jesus Christ is our foundation. I believe in him, and I draw strength from Alma's words about the atonement, where Jesus Christ came to take upon him our infirmities, that his bowels may be filled with mercy, that he may know how to succor us according to their infirmities. And in that moment, I think that mercy that he feels towards us, we can feel as we seek to develop more kindness, love, and acceptance to everybody within the family of and community of our heavenly parents. That's what I believe, and that's what I hope.
Thank you, David, for sharing your thoughts. Just as background for our listeners, David sent me this talk that he gave in his ward, and I'm aware of the work he's done, and I felt impressed that we should create a podcast about his talk, as I work with so many that are working to finding a way to believe, and so many that are interested in helping others that are struggling. There's such a need for David's words and his insight, his research, and his understanding, and his empathy and his heart. And I'm David, my dear brother and friend. I'm touched by your words. I'm touched by the Spirit I feel as you talk about them. They're words that are full of hope. They're words that are healing. They're words that help me believe in our restored church and with Christ at the foundation. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's neat to share this microphone with you. We've shared a lot of life together, but this is kind of the first time we've ever done something like this, and I appreciate you having the platform to be able to entertain these kinds of ideas. I have, having been a leader and having realized I really kind of knew nothing in some of my leadership roles, I felt a need to find ways to help leaders understand kind of the 21st century problems that we have. And that's why I've wanted to kind of reach out beyond a calling in our stake to be able to, find ways to communicate to leaders. I think leaders want to do things in a way that's really, really effective. And I think as we're kind of in the middle of a unique time and circumstance with regards to faith, that leaders are looking for ways to be more effective. One of the things that I'd like to do over the next period of time, maybe months or a year or so, is to be able to talk with leaders and find out what they're doing that works, and to be able to share that with other leaders that are looking for solutions. I think there's a lot of creativity in the church, and I think that whether it's a primary president or a young men's president or anyone in the ward council or in any sort of leadership role, as they perceive the problem and work through solutions, I think many of them are looking for ideas that will help them to be more effective. No one wants to see a loved one turn away from something that we value and is very beautiful. So if there's listeners that have leadership roles that would like to talk, please reach out to me. I'd love to spend a half hour with you talking about the way you've seen your leadership role against the backdrop of these kinds of faith challenges.
How would a leader contact you, Dave?
My email address is on the website, stakeandwardresources.com. So they can just email me if they'd like, and then we can make arrangements to communicate directly.
And in closing, will you tell us a little bit about your website, Dave?
Well, I'm retired, which means I have too much time on my hands. And in this
now,
calling,
if you're retired, David, and I'm 5 years younger than you, do I need to be retired in 5 years too?
The best I can tell, you're mostly retired anyway.
Well said.
You show up everywhere that unexpectedly. I do know you work, and you've got a very successful business. But
anyway, tell us about this website. I like that.
So as a part of my effort to understand this, I've just read everything that I can. And what's interesting is it's not consolidated anywhere. So if you kind of try and find, where are all the materials that help you understand how to create a welcoming culture, there isn't a place to do that. At least I haven't found it. I found wonderful materials that speak kind of one-off on each of these. And so what I found as I was going through this and trying to communicate with leaders, that I had all of these Word documents with, kind of all these quotes and references. And you kind of got me onto this and told me how easy it is to create a website so that you could kind of organize all of these materials in a way that someone would be able to find answers to their to questions. And so I took your advice and built this and compiled it. I'm not sure it's very good. It's got a lot of stuff on it, but I think I'll spend some time and continue to enhance it and get feedback on what could be done to make it more accessible and make it a tool that a leader could go to that would help them know how to be more effective in their calling.
Thank you. Once again, for our listeners, that website address is stakeandwardresources.com. David Ostler email is on there, and I like that he wants to reach out and hear more stories. He specifically mentioned other leaders that are working to understand and minister. And in my circle, there's many leaders wanting to do everything they can as part of ministering to reach out and support those that have stepped away or those that are here, but either silently struggling or confiding in a leader about how they feel. So I love this site. I encourage all of our listeners to go to it. I encourage our listeners to share it with their local leaders. And I think David is saying this isn't a final product. He wants to continue to bring the very best resources into one spot so that there is a way for us as local leaders to help others. Any concluding comments, Dave?
Well, I'm very optimistic about these challenges in the church. They're real. There's people that are really hurt and hurting. But I'm optimistic that we will continue to find ways to adapt to the needs of our people. I think that's part of our prophetic leadership is making change. Maybe slower than some like, but everyone who I have met loves people, loves God, and wants to be able to respond to the needs of people. And they're creative and passionate, as we all are. And we'll find ways to be more effective in this. We'll find ways to be better. And I'm hopeful that that's sufficient for the Lord.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, our listeners. We're glad you were here on the podcast, Listen, Learn, and Love. We're grateful for our guest today, David Ostler. I have a hunch that David Ostler will be a guest again as he continues to share his unique and very powerful, thoughtful, humble, and spiritual voice on this topic that is so important for many of our members. Thank you for joining us.